Energy Transition Now with David Linden.
Hello everyone, I'm your host, David Linden, the Head of Energy Transition for the Westwood Global Energy Group. And you're listening to another great episode of Energy Transition Now, where we discuss what the transition really means for the oil and gas and the broader energy industry. We're increasingly, I guess, being urged to listen to the science, to follow the science, to make some real world action on climate change. And so while we have touched on the science in this series before, we had the glaciologist Martin Seeger in the last series being a great example of that. My very special guest today is Zeke Hausfather, who's the climate research lead at Stripe, and you guessed it, a climate scientist. So welcome, Zeke.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Perfect. I think you are actually officially our first California-based guest as well. So you get to wear that special badge for today as well. So thank you for that.
I won't brag about our weather here this time of year.
No, I wasn't. I was thinking about the weather. Now look outside my window at this time, and it is rather pathetic in comparison, I'm sure. But you do have a heat wave in another way, I suppose, or had a heat wave. So
yeah,
pros and cons.
Well, our challenge is we now have a smoky season. The wildfires have gotten so bad that there's a good month or so of the summer where we have to keep all our doors and windows closed and can't go outside as much as we used to.
Interesting. Yeah, I saw you posted something about that there aren't actually necessarily more fires. It's just that they burn for longer and I guess more intensity, and there's more smokiness, I guess, as a result.
Yeah, so we actually have fewer fires here in California on an annual basis on average than we had 50 years ago. But the typical fire burns 5 times more area. And part of the reason is that, we have both so much built up dead undergrowth in the forests, and they're so dry that it's really a tinderbox.
Goodness. All right. Well, sure hope there aren't too many this season at all. But look, I think it's always nice to start off with these sort of podcasts just to introduce, because we do quite a wide-ranging set of conversations with different people from different backgrounds. And I always like to do a bit of a kind of a basic intro as to what is it you do and how do you do it type thing. And I saw, actually, it's quite interesting. I saw it on your Twitter feed, and I saw it on my one. Someone had noted it to me, but there was a cartoon that came out where there was this exchange of two people. One of them said, "I need to warn you about the future." And the other one's responded saying, "Holy sugar, are you a time traveler?" The other guy responded and said, "No, I'm a climate scientist." And the other guy said, "Boring." So I thought that was a pretty harsh critique of essentially your role. So I want you to take that as your challenge for today, as to, essentially defend climate scientists and the work that you do. And, we'll work to dispel that notion. But, I thought that was pretty harsh.
Maybe it's our new communication strategy. We just need to pretend to be time travelers from the future. And
the Matrix is back. Okay, so with that in mind, then I guess essentially, for folks who don't know, we've talked to a lot of people from the industry, we've talked to various academics, etc., but we haven't talked, as I said, a proper climate scientist. Although a glaciologist would argue, of course, they form part of the climate science community. But can you just maybe explain to us what is climate science and what kind of role does it play for us?
So you sort of nailed it when you said glaciology is part of the bigger community. Climate science is a very big tent within which there's a lot of subdisciplines. So there's atmospheric physicists who sort of study the radiative transfer of gases in the atmosphere. There's great glaciologists who study sort of ice sheets. There's oceanographers who study, ocean carbon cycles, biogeochemistry, ocean pH. There are paleoclimatologists who study climate proxies of the Earth's distant past. There's climate modelers who sort of build physics-based simulations of the climate's future. There's observational climate people who collect all the data from ships and weather stations and try to stitch it together in the past in the most accurate way. And sort of every one of these is its own silo with thousands of scientists working within it. And we sort of have various community efforts like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where you try to synthesize all of those different disciplines into sort of a single comprehensive picture of, this is how the climate has changed in the past, and this is how it may change in the future. And then, of course, feeding into that, there's the whole separate world of energy system modelers who sort of develop models of what the future might look like in terms of our emissions and our energy mix.
So are they essentially individuals that are looking at different parts of the climate, but from quite a specific narrow lens? Or, because it's like a glaciologist, I would say, sounds like someone who's looking at ice, but they're trying to work out what that means globally. So that has, what's the kind of general impact? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a lot on the scientist. One scientist may spend their entire career studying one glacier in Antarctica and be the world expert on that specific thing and, have more knowledge than anyone else. Other scientists try to be a bit more generalist. They might not have quite that deep a subject area knowledge on any particular part of climate science, but they dabble in a lot of different areas and try to do higher impact things and sort of synthesize different parts of climate science together. I definitely tend to think of myself a bit on the latter side. I like dabbling, but I also very much admire the specialists who dig super deep into one topic area.
Yeah, I guess the difficulty I found when I first looked at the space was trying to work out who the expert is, because you're right, someone might know something very specific about an area, but trying to translate that and help people understand what that really means. Are they looking at it too narrowly? Are they looking at just that area? And so, yeah, of course, they're going to make that statistical significant argument because essentially that makes sense in their world. But hang on, the guy over here who's looking at a different part of climate science might completely disagree. And so how is it someone like yourself who goes, okay, let me take all these different bits and pieces and put those together that's kind of needed? Or does that kind of just happen naturally, as you say, through the IPCC and places like that, where all those views come together?
So I think it's a mix of both. There's a fair number of generalists who are sort of trying to put the pieces together all the time, but there's also these big community assessment processes like the IPCC, which happens every 5 years or so, or 7 years. But also there's increasingly very robust national climate assessment operations. So the US, we have a national climate assessment that happens regularly. In the UK, my friend Richard Betts over there at the Met Office and many others are involved in the UK version of that. And the European countries have their own. So, it is a challenge because it's such a big area with so many moving parts and so many complexities, going from like socioeconomic and energy modeling to climate physics modeling to observational data to everything else that, no one person is going to know it all. And it's good to have these big community processes to bring together thousands of scientists and synthesize, tens of thousands of research papers in order to, give us the best picture of what is going on, what we know, and where the remaining uncertainties are, because, the Earth is a very complex system. And while we have a lot more confidence in what we know now than, say, 50 years ago, there still are some pretty big unknowns when it comes to the future of our climate.
Come back to that in just a minute then. But what if I was to sort of be let's say a non-scientist coming at this and sort of would say, okay, so what are the top 5 things that you're looking at and you're constantly focused on, as to sort of say that these are the climate indicators we need to worry about? I mean, to me, it sounds obvious. It's something like temperature and carbon, emissions parts per millions or whatever that you look at. But what are the kind of, call it top 5? You might have more, you might have less, to sort of simplify the story for us all. But what is it essentially that despite all these different specialisms, what are the top things that people focus on to give us an indicator of what's happening to our climate? And
yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of climate data that we're measuring, particularly in the last 30 years when we have satellite measurements, monitoring the Earth in real time. But there's definitely a few things that stand out, both because they're iconic, they're long-term records, and they're also some of the most physically meaningful in terms of measuring what's driving a lot of the impacts we're seeing. And the first is probably the one that gets the most attention, which is simply the global surface temperature record. I actually helped produce one of the 4 different global surface temperature records that are out there with a group called Berkeley Earth. But essentially what we do for that is we're gathering all of the data from all of the land-based weather stations, the ocean ships, the automated buoys, various other data sensors, and stitching them all together into a record of the Earth's average temperature. And by looking at that, we see that the Earth has warmed about 1.2 degrees centigrade since the late 1800s. And most of that warming, about 1 degree of it actually, has happened in the last 50, 60 years.
Okay.
So that's one of the major indicators. Another that is a shorter record, but in some ways is actually more meaningful from a climate standpoint, is ocean heat content. Because the atmosphere is actually not a very good store of heat. Air does not absorb much heat. And so because of that, the atmosphere can vary a fair bit in terms of how hot it is. Whereas upwards of 90% of the heat that's being trapped by greenhouse gases ends up going into the oceans. And so ocean heat content is a measurement of how the amount of heat in the oceans has changed over time. And nowadays we have this wonderful network called Argo of about 3,500 little robotic buoys that every day they dive deep down about 2,000 meters into the ocean, and they slowly come back up measuring temperature, salinity, pH, various other things. And then when they get to the top, they send that data up to a satellite called Jason, Jason and the Argonauts. And so for the last 20 years or so, we've had this really robust network giving us, near real-time measurements of ocean heat content. And the thing with ocean heat content is, it pretty much sets a new record every year. Like the surface varies a bit. Some years are warmer than others. El Nino years are warmer than La Nina years, which is a sort of mechanism that redistributes heat from the ocean to the atmosphere. But almost every single year sets a new record for ocean heat content. And that's because that's really where all the energy in the climate system is going. And so it's really a very robust measure of the amount of heat trapped in the Earth's system by greenhouse gases. I guess the third major indicator I'd point to is simply the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We started measuring CO2 in the atmosphere in Mauna Loa in the 1940s. Before that, we have fairly robust measurements from both Greenland and Antarctica of the amount of CO2 trapped in bubbles in the ice, which you can use to get a sense of how much CO2 is in the atmosphere at various periods of time. The nice thing about CO2 in particular, CO2 is not nice for many reasons, but one of the nice things about it from a physics standpoint is that it's well mixed throughout the atmosphere. The CO2 concentration in North America is going to be the same as, plus or minus 1 or 2 parts per million as Antarctica or Europe or Australia. And so being able to measure it anywhere in the world gives you a good sense of what it is everywhere in the world, which is one of the reasons that even though we don't have great modern observations of CO2 prior to the 1940s, we can actually be quite confident in what global values were, for the past, at least 4 million years or so, which provides a really good record. And we know from these measurements that today the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are far higher than anything the world has seen for the last few million years at a minimum, and probably the last few tens of millions of years.
So just as a quick one there, so that's kind of your top 3. I like that so far. But why is it? To me, it's really the first time I've heard that we've got such good measurements on ocean heat content, and it's actually far more important in some respects in terms of explaining what's going on. Why is it in some respects I've not heard about it as much, and I'm hearing much more about CO2 concentrations and 1.2 degrees and all those sorts of things? I mean, if you think about any of the kind of groups that are out there, like, is it because it's kind of what Paris hooked onto? Everyone hooks onto what Paris said, and so it's the 1.52 degree thing, and therefore then it's about measuring and coming up with plans aligned with that just seems easier rather than trying to work out what's happening to the ocean? Or
I mean, it's a good question. I think one of the main reasons we don't hear as much about it is we don't live in the oceans. we live on the surface, and so the surface temperature is what tends to get all the attention. But also, the record is reliable for surface temperatures back to the mid 1800s. Maybe plus or minus 1/10 of a degree or 2. For ocean heat content, we really only have very high quality records since the early 2000s. There are a lot of different groups that have produced reconstructions going back to the 1950s or so, or even before in a few cases. But the uncertainties are much larger with that. We can definitely see the direction it's going. There's no possibility that ocean heat content was as high in the 1950s as it is today. It's not that type of uncertainty, but it's not nearly as precise when you go back more than 2 decades. And so for that reason, I think a lot of people have treated the surface temperature as a much more iconic indicator And in a lot of ways, surface temperature maps better with the sort of the impacts that we see, in terms of heat waves, extreme weather events, all those sort of things. The ocean heat content tracks very closely with sea level rise. So, different drivers of different things.
And if we come back to the idea that, I mean, from what I can hear from you there, is we've essentially started to get better at A, measuring, and B, understanding what's happening to our climate. And, I guess you also said that there's still a lot of unknowns. Maybe it's worth just dealing with that question there for a minute. How much of an unknown are we talking about here? I mean, there's lots of things that we don't understand in our world. Obviously, it took us a while to work out everything from gravity to whatever, right? But is this science will always have unknowns, of course, but how big of a field of unknown is there out there?
That's a great question, and it's useful to go back a bit in time. Scientists first postulated the idea of CO2 as a greenhouse gas and increasing in the atmosphere causing warming in the late 1800s with Arrhenius, Tyndall, Fourier. And that sort of languished a bit, particularly after some papers that were published that suggested, oh, wait, maybe the atmosphere is saturated, so adding more CO2 doesn't actually have much of an impact. Turns out those ones are wrong, but they really led to not much focus on the field for about 50 years. And so the 1950s, the issue was sort of rediscovered in the scientific world, especially as we started getting these records of atmospheric CO2 suggesting it was increasing. And then it was really in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we started seeing an explosion of, and really the birth of what we'd call modern climate science, with sort of the first physics-based climate models, huge investments in increasing the number of observations we have, and specifically going back and collecting all these historical observations, all these handwritten ship captain logs of temperature measurements from 1890 that had been sitting in a basement somewhere in London for 80 years. And then in the early 90s, the IPCC was started to sort of help synthesize and bring together the scientific community and coordinate a lot of the modeling work that was done, as well as the scenario planning. And so, over time, we've gotten a lot more confidence and a lot more understanding of these systems and a lot better ability to model them and measure them. And so today, there's a few things that are pretty incontrovertible. Like even a lot of the scientists who are more sort of skeptical of the severity of climate change would agree on the basics, and that is, CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing. That increase is due to human activity. The amount that's in the atmosphere very closely matches the amount of coal, oil, and gas we burn. That CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat. Without CO2, the Earth would be much, much cooler. Life would not be possible, most likely, in most places. And that, if we keep burning fossil fuels, the world will keep warming. So that's what we all agree on. Where there's some disagreement is exactly how much the Earth will warm in the future. And that really comes down to a question of what other factors change as CO2 increases that will either enhance or reduce the amount of warming we'd experience. So if we were to ignore everything else in the Earth system and only increase CO2 in the atmosphere, if we doubled the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the Earth would warm about 1 degree C, which is not that much. I mean, it's a decent amount, but it's not
the average,
that,
right? It's some areas are hit more than others, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, but in reality, given all of the complex interactions of the Earth system, we think that if we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the Earth will warm closer to 3 degrees. And the reason for that is because of what we call climate feedbacks. So the biggest one of those is water vapor. Water vapor itself is a very strong greenhouse gas, but it's also very short-lived in the atmosphere. If you get too much water vapor, it falls out as rain. But the amount of water vapor that can be in the air before it rains out is determined by the temperature of the air. So a warmer world is one where the air can effectively hold more water vapor, which means that there's more heat being trapped by that water vapor, since water vapor itself absorbs certain frequencies of outgoing long wave radiation. It's a greenhouse gas. And so that water vapor feedback by itself, adds roughly doubles the effect of CO2 warming. On top of that, there's large changes in the reflectivity of the Earth's surfaces associated with warming. So, as snow and ice melt, it gets replaced by darker surfaces, trees, vegetation that absorb more of the sun's light. As sea ice melts, it gets replaced by darker ocean water that absorbs more of the sun's light, bounces less back up to space. That enhances the amount of warming. There's other feedbacks that can work the opposite way. So the warmer the surface gets, the more energy goes back out to space. In fact, the amount of energy going back out to space from the surface is the fourth power of the temperature of the surface. And so that's a big factor that prevents sort of climate from running away and spiraling and sort of out of control warming, is that you sort of get much more energy going back to space as the surface temperature increases. And then there's just some big unknowns around things like clouds and exactly how they will respond. Some types of clouds, particularly those that are higher up in the atmosphere, tend to be better at trapping heat. Other types of clouds, such as those that are lower, closer to the surface, tend to be better at reflecting the sun's rays back to space. The mix of high and low clouds you get as the Earth warms, and exactly how that changes is an area of pretty big uncertainty. And so we're not going to know precisely how much warming we're going to get until we get better measurements and better models of those things. There's another big uncertainty around what we call aerosols, which are not spray cans, but rather little floating particles in the atmosphere, things like sulfur dioxide, that are reflective. So they're like slightly shiny, so some of the sun's light bounces off them, goes back to space. They can also serve as cloud condensation nuclei. So you need a certain amount of bits of dust and aerosols in the air for clouds to form readily. And so the more you have, the more clouds you can form, and then clouds have their own complicated climate effects. And so, exactly how aerosols are affecting the climate and how our emissions of them are going to change over time will also have a big impact on, the degree of climate change we're going to get. And then the final big area of uncertainty is our own emissions. We could have a world where we double CO2 by the end of the century, or we could have a world where we cut it close to zero. And obviously that's going to have a huge effect on the results. But if we sort of back up a little bit and look at what we expect to happen in the future, there's a metric that climate scientists like to use that I alluded to a little bit earlier that we call climate sensitivity. And the way we usually define climate sensitivity is if we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, say from pre-industrial levels, so it actually doesn't really matter that much where you start, how much warming would we expect to experience, over the next few hundred years, if we just double it and hold it there. And for a very long time, that range has been pretty wide. So back in late 1970s, the first real estimate of this was the Charney report. And they said if we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the world will probably warm somewhere between 1.5 degrees centigrade and 4.5 degrees centigrade. Flash forward nearly 30 years, in the 2013 IPCC report, they said if we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the world will probably warm somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees centigrade. So the fact that we hadn't really reduced that uncertainty substantially in nearly 30 years was not great. To be honest, the original estimate was probably too precise. But we have had some good news in that particular area. The most recent IPCC report that we published this past year actually narrowed that range substantially for the first time in 30 years. And they say now that if we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the world will likely warm somewhere between 2.5 C and 4 C. So we're getting it much more.
The narrowing, but actually the bad news is the lower boundary's gone up. Because you got 1.5 to 2.5, yeah. So,
but the upper boundary's gone down. So now it's 2.5 to 4 instead of 1.5 to 4.5. So there's a silver lining there, but it means very gloomy. Yeah. But you're right. It does mean that we're less likely, or at least it seems now that we're less likely to get lucky and have climate sensitivity end up being low and much less warming than we expected.
Okay, but I guess part of it's down to the, as you I guess suggest there is it's just a better understanding of what's going on. Ability to measure it, ability to forecast it. It's just got better. And so you can start to narrow that range of uncertainty going forward. It just seems like a natural pathway to go down.
Yeah. We're getting better measurements of these things. We're getting higher resolution models on faster supercomputers. Models are an interesting area. Climate models are far from perfect. The Earth is an incredibly complicated system. It's hard to get everything right, but at the same time, they've really improved by leaps and bounds over the last few decades. I actually led a group of scientists on a research project 2 years ago now. We published a paper looking at all of the climate models that have been published since the first one in 1970 that said, we think this is going to happen to the world by this date, some sort of concrete prediction of what would happen to global temperatures, global surface temperatures. And so we looked at all of those models published between 1970 and the mid 2000s, and then compared them to what actually happened after they were published. And it was interesting. Most models actually did a pretty good job of predicting the warming that occurred. 11 of the 18 models that we found, were pretty much spot on. They're indistinguishable from the observed trend in temperatures in the real world. And of those that didn't perfectly match, I think 4 had slightly too much warming, 3 had a bit too low warming. But by and large, these models did a good job of predicting the future after they were published. So out of sample, so to speak. And that's particularly impressive for the early models, the ones published in, say, the 1970s, when we didn't really even know that the world was warming. Like, we didn't have a great collection of historical temperatures back then. We hadn't gone around the world and digitized all these old ship logs. Like, most scientists in the 1970s thought that global temperatures had been flat or even slightly cooling for the last few decades, in part because our records are almost entirely based on weather stations in the Northern Hemisphere on the land, which did show that. They didn't have any ocean data. And so to be able to say that, like, hey, the world has been cooling, we think, for the last 3 decades, but that's going to reverse, and we're actually going to see 0.6 C warming by the year 2000, as Wally Broker did in his paper in Science in 1975, was pretty remarkable. And what's more remarkable is we saw exactly that, 0.6 C warming by the year 2000 relative to 1975 when he published that paper. So the performance of these old climate models, which were much more basic than the sort of supercomputer models we have today, the fact that they could get it right is definitely encouraging that our current models are not too far off.
Very interesting. I guess people can take a bit of, call it hope, or take a view on the fact that, look, things have got better, they're more accurate, but essentially the picture or the outlook is still the same, right? It is essentially a world that's getting warmer, et cetera, et cetera. But there have been some effective, whether it's the hockey stick kind of diagram that's come out around world temperatures, or I forgot who came up with that image of the changing color bars as well.
Yeah.
That
Ed Hawkins and the climate stripes.
Ed Hawkins, yeah. That's the chap. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll see that on I think it's Greta's new book that's coming out, or the different essays she's collected soon as well. But that sort of imagery. You almost get, this is the way that people will ultimately consume some of this. And there's been a lot of activity, a lot of noise. We've had COP 26, etc., and others before that who've made all these warnings and let people know that you need to change, etc. What is it in your mind, though, that isn't getting people to maybe make enough, or take that seriously enough? Because if we did take it all seriously, right now, every country in the world and every person in the world and every company in the world would be committed to saying, okay, actually, sorry about that. Let me just recognize that we've done a very good scientific, backed up study here. And this tells us over many years, over multiple studies, thousands of scientists, et cetera, who globally all agree that this is the problem. Why are people not responding to this kind of thing is, I guess, the kind of question I'm trying to ask here.
It's a big question. I mean, I think it's important to emphasize that we are responding, not necessarily as quickly as we'd like, but we are starting to see real movement. Particularly in the last 2 years, we've started to see more and more countries around the world, including India, China, EU, the UK, the US, Brazil, Japan, commit to get their emissions down to net zero by the middle of the 21st century. In fact, countries representing over 75% of global emissions have now made those commitments. And if they followed through on all those commitments, we would actually succeed, most likely at least, in limiting warming to below 2 degrees, if not 1.5. So, I think we should emphasize that there are some things moving in the right direction. Clean energy is getting cheap. Global coal use likely peaked back in 2013 and is probably in structural decline. Electric vehicles are 14% of global vehicle sales in the last quarter. There's a lot of trends moving in the right direction. They're just not happening quickly enough to meet our most ambitious climate goals. It's easy for politicians to say they're going to do something in 30 to 50 years. It's a lot harder to actually take concrete actions today that put us on a pathway to meet those goals. So, I certainly think we should treat those net zero commitments, in 2050 with a proverbial boulder of salt, particularly, for those of us not in the UK, who don't have this sort of thing, actually legally mandated, and have governments that, can get stuff done to put us toward that direction. But that said, it is a good question of why we're not doing it faster and why there isn't more impetus around these things. And, there's a couple of different answers to that, right? One is that we as a society are just really bad at dealing with long-term problems. Our election cycles are short-term. The issues we tend to focus on day to day are short-term around the economy or crime or those sort of things. And so while a lot of people care about climate in the abstract, they see it as an issue that's less pressing right now than all these other things that are facing them. And so it's hard to keep people's attention on it for a long period of time. Now that's starting to change a little bit as we're starting to see more and more extreme events that are, at least in part attributable to climate change. Here in California, for example, as I alluded to earlier, we now have a smoke season, which is a pretty big impact of climate change staring us in the face. Or, my home here was built in the 1970s, never had any sort of air conditioning. We had to put one in last summer after enough days of, close to 40 C. And so, there are definitely changes that are getting to be big enough that people are starting to see them, but it's just hard to break through relative to all these other priorities people have. The other challenge is that it's become, at least in some countries, a very political issue. Particularly in the US, Canada, and Australia, there's a very big left-right split, not just on the preferred solutions to climate change, but even the extent to which it's a problem that requires addressing. And while I think it is very good to have public policy debates around the solutions, I think when the science itself becomes politicized, it can lead to big problems for society.
Interesting. No, it is a difficult one. Is it a technical problem? Is it a political problem? Is it a social problem in terms of moving things forward? I guess that's almost like a circular debate there, because it kind of just depends on where you are in the world as well. But you alluded to some of the kind of the progress points that we have made, and you sort of listed a few just quickly there, but maybe we could just quickly revisit some of those. If we were to sort of take our heads out of the doom and gloom, the pathway we're on is not the pathway we want to be, and we've got to be skeptical about some of the, I don't want to say politicians, but essentially that's it, commitments we're making. What is it in your mind that we have achieved that is actually a very positive thing that's leading us down the right path?
Yeah, so to borrow a term that was popularized in COVID, we really have bent down the curve of future emissions in a way that wasn't true a decade ago. A decade ago, it certainly seemed plausible the world was headed toward a 21st century dominated by coal, with 4, even 5 degrees warming by the end of the century. Global coal use had almost doubled in the previous decade. China was building a new coal plant every 3 days. And today we're in a very different world. Coal use has plateaued globally, and even mostly plateaued in China. They're still building new plants, but the utilization of those plants is way down. We are in a world of increasingly cheap clean energy alternatives. Renewables have become much cheaper, much faster than I think anyone anticipated a decade ago. We've seen huge drops in the price of batteries. We've seen electric vehicles become much more cost competitive. We've seen LEDs take off in the lighting market, which use a fraction of the energy of conventional lighting. So I think we've sort of lucked out in some ways on the technology front. Now, technology alone is not going to save us. We need policy as well. But I think we underestimate a bit the extent to which technology enables policy. The fact that we are seeing the Chinas and the Indias of the world commit to ambitious net zero goals is in large part due to the fact that they now see a pathway to achieve those goals that doesn't come at a cost to their development priorities and their economic growth. And so to the extent that we have made clean energy cheap, I think it enables us to have more ambitious policy because the costs of that policy are more palatable. A world where solar power is 10 times cheaper than it was a decade ago is one where countries are a lot more willing to commit to build it than if there's sort of this huge premium that they're having to pay to transition away from fossil fuels. that then also comes at the expense of other priorities they have.
Okay. I mean, it's an interesting point around the technology side of things. There's clearly different camps who say technology will solve everything. So don't subsidize anything. Don't, get involved politics. The market will sort itself out because there's a problem, which is climate change, and you'll go in and you'll solve all the problems. What in your mind, if you were to sort of look at the different, call them pathways for argument's sake, what are the actual pathways that we can take to try and reach our target, call it 1.5 for argument's sake, or at least below 2 degrees going forward? Are there certain technologies that we will have to go if we want to take the technology angle, or are there sort of certain other levers that we're going to have to pull that are going to get us there? Or are we too late, in fact? And actually, look, sorry, David, being very optimistic here and asking for things that you just can't pull out of a bag, unfortunately.
I mean, I think it depends a bit on the pathway, right? I would argue that we're, to be honest, probably too late for 1.5 degrees, at least in the absence of a world where we get very, very lucky with, planetary scale deployment of carbon removal technologies later in the century, which, I work on those for my day job at Stripe. So hopefully that's a future we could see, but I think we also need to not bet on that. Like the challenge with 1.5 degrees is we're at 1.2 today. We have this vanishingly small remaining carbon budget to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And in the absence of net negative emissions, of removing more from the atmosphere than we're emitting, we'd have to cut all global emissions to zero in the next 20 years or so to avoid passing 1.5 degrees. If you allow a lot of negative emissions, like pretty much all of our models do, you can say we need to get to net zero globally by 2050, 2055. Even that is not consistent with the pledges that most countries have made today. So I just don't see much indication that there is the political will globally to make the degree of cuts needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. A particularly stark statistic is, a few months ago, the IPCC published its Working Group 3 report, which is the report on mitigation pathways. And they looked at 230 different scenarios that had been run to limit warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. And of those 230, 221 of them, so 96%, passed 1.5 degrees on the way there and then brought it back down. There are only 9 scenarios in the report that did not overshoot 1.5 degrees.
Okay, so these are the overshoot type scenarios.
Yeah.
Wow,
so I think that, barring some sort of dramatic public awakening around climate globally in the next few years, we are going to be in a world of overshooting 1.5 degrees. At the same time, the distance between 1.5 and 2 is actually pretty huge in terms of its emissions implications. So again, without any net negative emissions, without any net carbon removal, we'd have to get global emissions to zero in the early 2040s to meet 1.5 degrees. We'd have to get global emissions to zero in the 2070s to limit warming to, well below 2 degrees, or at least a 2 in 3 chance of avoiding 2 degrees warming. So a best estimate of like 1.8 degrees or so. And so, I have a hard time imagining global net zero in 2040 or 2050 for that matter, but I can definitely see, pathways to get us there in 2070 if we get our act together. So I think that, we're definitely in a world where we could limit warming to 1.7, 1.8, maybe even 1.6. I think the ship might have sailed at 1.5. We took too long to get our act together. In terms of how to get to these well below 2 degree goals, though, there's a few things that come to mind there, right? One is that it's important to realize there's very much a loading order of mitigation. Coal goes away first. It's the least cost competitive today. It's the most dirty and carbon intensive. They're the most mature alternatives to coal. Electricity generation is in many ways easier to transition than other sectors because you're dealing with a much smaller number of plants. The economics are much better for prematurely retiring them. The next sort of thing on that chain is oil. Again, we're having more cost competitive electric vehicles today, or oil is the second most carbon intensive fossil fuel. There's going to be some sectors like aviation that are going to be tough to fully eliminate, but we have alternatives in the pipeline that are cost competitive for a lot of others. And then the final thing that's sort of the hardest to eliminate, and that we see in our models is sort of the last thing that you get rid of is natural gas. It is the least carbon intensive of the fuels. It is used in applications that tend to be a lot harder to replace, things like industrial heat, even gas for electricity generation is dispatchable in a way that other sources find challenging. And gas for home heating, while we have increasingly cheap heat pumps, the turnover time for our housing stock is very long. And the economics of prematurely retrofitting and removing functional gas equipment to replace with electric heating is, it's a lot harder to kind of make that pencil out than, say, if you're doing it at the point of building new homes. So from a both utility and capital turnover time, it's a lot harder to fully get rid of gas. And so, we should sort of target our policies accordingly, I think, in terms of really prioritizing today, getting rid of coal as quickly as possible, and prioritizing new new applications that use electricity instead of gas, and sort of letting that the sort of fleet of installed buildings and technologies turn over there. And then in terms of the policy side to help push those, I think we need, like, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think technology alone is going to save us. And again, I think a big part of that is that the benefits of carbon emissions are privatized and the costs are socialized. That is that, the cost of climate change to society is not reflected in the market price of goods. And there's no mechanism outside of government intervention that can lead that to happen. And so there's been, a basis for having governments intervene in prices to internalize externalities in the economics discipline for 100 years. Arthur Pigou, famously posited the idea of Pigouvian taxes, and that have had a lot of buy-in from mainstream economists, including folks like Gregory Mankiw at Harvard, who was, the economic advisor for the Bush administration here in the U.S. He started a Pigou club of economists who want to internalize the cost of climate change in the price through carbon taxes. So, there's a lot of good reasons from an economic standpoint to do that. It's proven a lot more politically challenging in practice in many countries, particularly here in the US, where it turns out it's a lot easier to have carrots than sticks. It's a lot easier to pay things that are good rather than penalize things that are bad. And those are, not necessarily as economically optimal. You run into problems of governments picking winners. But there's also ways to design sort of technologically neutral subsidies for clean energy, for example, that can, if not quite as effective as a price on carbon, can at least get you close. And so I think that we are going to need to do some of that. Otherwise, we're sort of setting up an implicit subsidy for fossil fuels that's not enjoyed by clean energy. The fact that they cause all these societal harms that they don't have to pay for. And clean energy, on the flip side, is at least currently in most countries not, subsidized for not causing those harms. And so we need at least one of those two to really drive the level of adoption of the sector that would be, society and economically optimal.
Okay. And I guess that's a particularly tough choice always, of course, to make, because if you talk about the cost of that transition, what you'd be almost arguing there is how do you effectively pass on that cost to consumer? And then people don't always understand, I guess, carbon taxes, because essentially carbon tax gets collected but then gets redistributed effectively, right? That's how it should work. But when the minute you say the word tax, people do not like that.
Yeah. And again, we don't need to be a slave to what is economically optimal, right? If we're in a second best world where we're just subsidizing clean energy for, the fact that it's not causing pollution, that itself is good. Or, we're in a more regulatory regime where we're restricting, both conventional and greenhouse gas pollution from fossil fuels in one way or another, can help, drive adoption. So, I originally came from a world of climate economics, and I was very much into the perfect optimal model, there's sort of market outcomes back as a grad student in college. But the more time I spend in the real world, I realized that sometimes the second or third best world is still better than the world we're in today.
That's an interesting outcome there. All right. Okay. Very interesting indeed. Just as a quick one on natural gas, there's an interesting one there around how it kind of came third order in your list of sort of, coal, then oil, then natural gas, just because of the reality around how these things work. Is one of the dangers the world that we have right now, and I'm sitting here in Europe, right? So we have a particularly acute need to switch out one particular country's fuel for another one. And
Mhm.
so it's a rush to LNG as an example, right? Which is encouraging other countries, further afield, obviously, including the US, but I'm thinking as far afield as, Mozambique and Australia, etc. So, well, let's actually sanction all these big projects that are going to be around for 20 to 30 to 40 years, producing more LNG because, essentially the world now needs that. But these things are sanctioned on the basis they're going to work for 20 to 30 to 40 years.
Mhm.
Is the danger there that this is a short-term thing that we're seeing in Europe, but actually longer term where the climate kind of, how we're trying to change the world is that those projects essentially, we always talk about stranded assets and those sorts of things do become stranded because that's where the world is having to trend, or is because natural gas isn't as hard hit as coal and oil in the grand scheme of what the problem is, essentially, look, there's space here for some additional LNG to come into the world. I'm just making one example, right?
Mhm.
There are millions of different arguments made all over the place for different projects, whether they should be coming online or not. But just specifically of the world we're in right now, the dilemma that Europe faces, security supply, and then encouraging other countries to essentially sanction new projects to feed them. Is that a realistic solution in that sense, or should we be looking at the world in a different way?
I mean, it's definitely a suboptimal outcome in many ways, though I don't think any of the alternatives right now are particularly great. Another option is and which is already happening to extent, is to double down on coal use in Europe,
Yeah,
which is from a climate standpoint considerably worse. But there is this question of infrastructure, right? If you are building these big LNG terminals, they're going to be around for many decades. How do you deal with that? Are you locking in future gas use in a way that you wouldn't otherwise if you weren't building these? And I think there are some ways to mitigate that. One is to make sure that all of the new LNG facilities are also designed with hydrogen in mind, because we may have a global hydrogen economy where we're shipping hydrogen rather than methane in a low carbon future. But also there's this question of where we're aiming, right? It is very hard to justify any new gas development in a 1.5C world, or at least net gas development. You could have potentially less in North America and more in Africa. But if you're talking about a 1.8 degree world or 1.7 degree world, then maybe it's a little less inconsistent as long as we've pretty much gotten rid of it all by 2050 or so, right? So it's sort of this question of where we're aiming in terms of what degree of long tail of fossil fuel use we can have. But I think the important thing is that while we might be diversifying our supply of gas, we're also, as quickly as possible, reducing our reliance on gas and other fossil fuels that are, in many ways been equally impacted. Price of coal has skyrocketed, price of oil has skyrocketed. And I think that those all send powerful both market and policy signals to countries that there is a need to reduce our exposure to price risk around these things. Clean energy technologies have their own challenges around intermittency and other issues, but at least they're reasonably reliable in terms of long-term pricing. You're not going to have the price of electricity from solar suddenly triple or increase tenfold as gas has. So they're definitely a strong incentive to diversify and to invest more in clean energy as fossil fuel prices become high. And I think at the end of the day, the overall climate impact of this entire geopolitical challenge that Europe is facing right now might end up being positive for the climate, simply because it is accelerating this transition in a way that was harder when fossil fuels were cheaper.
Super, Zeke. So look, I think we're all coming close to the end of our time, as always the problem with these conversations.
It always goes by too fast.
Yeah, it does. It's far too fast. I still have a list of questions in my head now, actually, around various topics. But I'll ask you a very big question, I guess, near the end. I mean, look, you mentioned this earlier in terms of the pathways you mentioned and your role of what you do at Stripe as well, in terms of what your company focuses on as well. We've talked a lot about mitigation.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't talk that much about carbon removal as a concept. Now, it's a whole podcast in itself. I appreciate that. So let's not open the whole can of worms around that area. Could you maybe just share a little bit, though, around how important is carbon removal as such of what we're talking about here? How important could it be? So I'm talking how important is it now, and how important could it be? Because clearly someone like Stripe, is taking the lead in some of this, in terms of getting involved in it. But we are, it's a tiny, tiny industry right now relative to many other industries we might be talking about. So, it's a very big question I'm asking you here. But in terms of the things that we've talked about, how important is it now? How important can it be, or should it be, do you think, in your mind, in the future? And maybe if you've got anything around, what you're working on at Stripe there, you want to throw in terms of the role that you're taking on there, that'd be interesting to hear as well.
Yeah. So the short version of it is that, carbon removal, particularly permanent carbon removal, putting CO2 back into the ground or turning into rocks, is a tiny industry today. Something like 10,000 tons has been delivered as of last year globally. And we know we're going to need billions of tons for it. So it's an area where we can have an outsized impact because it's so nascent and sort of we know where it has to go. At the same time, we're always going to be in a world where it's, upwards of 90% mitigation, reducing our emissions, and probably only 10% or so carbon removal. But the reason we know we're going to need a decent chunk of carbon removal, at least a few billion tons of carbon removal a year, which is a very big number, particularly compared to 10,000 today, is for three reasons. One is that there's going to be some sectors or some long tail emissions that's hard to fully eliminate. We might be able to get global emissions down 90, 95%, but that still leaves us with a couple gigatons of remaining CO2 emissions per year. The second is CO2 is not the only game in town. There's other greenhouse gases, particularly methane and nitrous oxide. And it turns out those are much harder to fully eliminate than CO2, in large part because of their sources from agriculture. We can probably, if we get rid of all fossil fuels, if we employ the best technologies, if we shift people's diets, if we do all that, we can probably cut their emissions by 2/3 or so. But that leaves this remaining third of methane and nitrous oxide emissions that need to be counterbalanced by something. And so we need at least a few billion tons a year of carbon removal just to balance out those. And then the final piece of the puzzle is that one area that the science has gotten much clearer about in recent years is what we call the zero emissions commitment associated with CO2. So the good news is our best estimate now is if we get CO2 emissions down to zero, the world will stop warming pretty quickly. There's not a huge amount of warming sort of in the pipeline or that's inevitable. The bad news there is, though, is even if we get emissions to zero, the world doesn't cool back down for many centuries to come without net negative emissions, without carbon removal. So the only way to deal with overshoot, the only way to ever bring temperatures back down, at least over timescales relevant to human beings, is to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so for those reasons, we know we're going to need it. We know that we're only going to need it in a world where we've, already, or where we're already reducing emissions. It certainly isn't a replacement for reducing emissions. There's no world where we're sucking out 40 billion tons of CO2 from the air, which is what we're emitting today. That would be bonkers and God knows how many trillions of dollars. But, we know that if we succeed with the mitigation side, we're also going to need a lot of removals. And right now it's an area that we've underinvested in, that we're sort of still playing catch up to. And so that's one of the reasons why Stripe is focused there, and increasingly, a number of other scientists and funders, not to take resources away from the much needed mitigation, but to complement them by also investing in this. And, we have a decade or so to figure out this space, to start scaling it up, to figure out what works, what doesn't work, because we're going to need these billions of tons per year by 2050 or so. We're not going to necessarily need them today. And so for that reason, we really want to cast a wide net. We want to try to explore a wide variety of different approaches. We want to fail fast, but we also want to be willing to fail, so we can learn what doesn't work. And to that end, we recently launched this new initiative called Frontier, along with Google, Meta, Shopify, McKinsey, where we committed to spend $1 billion over the next 9 years to sort of kickstart permanent carbon removal technologies, to fund a wide variety of early stage companies, to do bigger offtake agreements going forward with those that successfully deliver so they can scale up. And then to couple all of that with very rigorous monitoring, reporting, and verification, so we can actually track where that carbon is going and figure out, does kelp sinking actually permanently reduce carbon, or does that end up back in the atmosphere in one way or another? Those sort of questions.
I wish we had another hour. No, it is a fascinating topic in itself, and I've listened to many other people talk about it, and I'd love to maybe get you back another time, Zeke, to talk about that, because it's certainly another whole area that people spend a lot of time talking about. But as you rightly said, it's small now, but has a huge potential and can certainly add a lot to the opportunity set of how we can reduce the temperatures on our planet. But for now, thank you so much for taking the time that you have, for not making it boring in the slightest, but very interesting indeed, and for sharing, essentially, what a climate scientist does and what you guys focus on, and the breadth of things there, and the complexity, but also sort of looking at the pathways, and I think, as you rightly said there, the optimistic side of things as well, of what we can do to achieve it. So thanks very much, Zeke. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Perfect. And thanks everyone else for listening as well. If you enjoyed that, which I'm sure you did, please do hit subscribe, give us a great rating, and share with your friends. Talk to you next time.